When Ethan Sullivan walked into the courtroom, he thought he was fighting for a house, his rightful inheritance, promised to him since childhood. But what started as a legal battle against his own grandfather quickly unraveled into something far more shocking. A hidden truth. A mother he thought was dead. A past built on lies. As secrets unfold and loyalties are tested, Ethan must decide. Will he cling to his anger, or will he embrace the painful truth and rebuild what was lost? This is not just a fight over property, it's a fight for family, for forgiveness, and for a future he never expected. Get ready for a story filled with twists, betrayals, and life-changing revelations. And before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story that keeps you on the edge of your seat. Ethan Sullivan took a deep breath as he stepped into the courtroom. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made every spectator lean forward in their seats. Opposing him sat his grandfather, Walter Sullivan, an 81-year-old war veteran with piercing blue eyes that held a quiet confidence. Ethan's attorney, Richard Carter, stood beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Are you sure about this?" Richard whispered. "I have no choice," Ethan muttered, his jaw tightening. "That house was supposed to be mine." At the court bench, Judge Eleanor Whitmore adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat. "Let's proceed. Mr. Sullivan, you claim that your grandfather unfairly altered his will, removing you as the beneficiary of his estate, specifically his residence at 12 Oakwood Lane. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Ethan replied firmly. Walter let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "I didn't change my will unfairly. I changed it because it was the right thing to do." Ethan clenched his fists. "Then why wasn't I informed?" "Because you never asked the right questions," Walter said cryptically. Richard stepped forward. "Your Honor, my client has lived in that house since childhood. He was led to believe it would be passed down to him. We contest that Mr. Walter Sullivan was manipulated into altering his will under undue influence." Walter's lawyer, Margaret Lawson, smirked. "Undue influence? Do you have evidence, Mr. Carter?" Richard hesitated. "We believe there was external pressure." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "And who do you think pressured an 81-year-old man who survived wars, raised a family, and built a legacy?" The court gallery murmured. Ethan's frustration grew. "Then explain why the house is being given to a woman named Sarah Whitman, someone I've never even heard of." A hush fell over the courtroom. Walter's smile didn't waver. "Because you never cared to know who she was." Judge Whitmore tapped her gavel. "Let's stay on track. Mr. Sullivan, who is Sarah Whitman?" Walter exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "She's someone important, but I don't think Ethan is ready to hear the truth yet." Ethan gritted his teeth. "I think I deserve to know why my inheritance is being stolen." Walter's face hardened. "The real theft here, Ethan, is not about property. It's about what you let yourself believe." Margaret stood up. "Your Honor, we request a brief recess before we present further evidence." "Regarding the will?" Judge Whitmore nodded. "Granted. Court will reconvene in 30 minutes. As the judge left the courtroom, Ethan turned to Richard. "What the hell just happened?" Richard shook his head. "I don't know, but we need to find out who Sarah Whitman is. Fast." Meanwhile, Walter sat calmly, watching his grandson with an unreadable expression. He had set things in motion, and soon Ethan would realize this was never about the house. It was about something far more important. The truth was coming, and the court trial had only just begun. Ethan paced outside the courtroom, his mind racing. Who was Sarah Whitman? Why would his grandfather, a man who had always spoken about family loyalty, leave the house to a complete stranger? None of it made sense. Richard scrolled through his phone, fingers tapping furiously as he searched the name. Nothing significant comes up. There are a few Sarah Whitmans in the state, but no obvious connection to Walter. Ethan exhaled sharply. There has to be a reason. He's playing some kind of mind game. Richard looked up. What if this isn't just about the house? What if Walter is testing you? Ethan scoffed. Testing me? For what? I've been there for him. I took care of that house while he was in and out of the hospital. And now he's handing it to some mystery woman? Before Richard could respond, the bailiff's voice rang through the hallway. Court is back in session. Ethan squared his shoulders and marched back into the courtroom, determination burning in his chest. He took his seat while Walter remained as composed as ever, his lawyer Margaret flipping through her neatly stacked documents. Judge Whitmore adjusted her glasses. Let's proceed. Mr. Sullivan, do you have any evidence to support your claim that Mr. Walter Sullivan was influenced into changing his will? Richard stood. Your Honor, we believe there was an outside factor that led to this change. The sudden appearance of Sarah Whitman as a beneficiary raises questions about the legitimacy of this decision. My client has every right to challenge the will and demand clarity. Margaret stood as well, a confident smirk on her lips. Your Honor, my client is fully capable of making his own decisions. And as for Sarah Whitman, she turned toward Walter. Would you like to explain who she is? Walter leaned forward, his voice steady. Sarah Whitman is Ethan's mother. Silence. The courtroom froze. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. His breath caught. What? He whispered, almost too softly for anyone to hear. Walter's gaze didn't waver. Sarah Whitman is the woman who gave birth to you, Ethan. And she's still alive. The gasps from the court gallery echoed through the room. Ethan gripped the edges of the table, his knuckles turning white. That's impossible. My mother died when I was a baby. Walter sighed. No, son. That's what we told you. Ethan shot up from his chair. You're lying. His voice cracked with disbelief, but deep inside, a tiny voice whispered, what if he's telling the truth? Richard placed a firm hand on Ethan's arm, urging him to sit down. Mr. Sullivan, he said cautiously, are you saying that Ethan's mother faked her death? Walter shook his head. No. I helped her disappear. Ethan's world spun. His mother alive? And his grandfather had known all these years? Judge Whitmore's voice broke the silence. Mr. Sullivan, this is a serious claim. Do you have evidence to support it? Margaret handed over a sealed envelope. Your Honor, inside this envelope is proof. Medical records, letters, and photographs dating back to the last 27 years. Judge Whitmore took the envelope, glancing at Ethan. Mr. Sullivan, do you wish to proceed with the case, given this new information? Ethan's mind screamed. He had come here to fight for a house, but now he was fighting for answers about his entire life. His voice wavered. I need to see that evidence. Walter nodded slowly. Then you're finally asking the right question. The court session was no longer about a house. It was about the truth. And Ethan wasn't sure if he was ready to hear it. Ethan sat frozen, his pulse pounding in his ears as Judge Whitmore opened the envelope. The crisp sound of paper shuffling filled the tense courtroom. Every pair of eyes was locked on the judge as she reviewed the documents. Ethan felt like the walls were closing in. His mother alive? The idea was absurd. He had spent his entire life believing she had died when he was just a baby. He had mourned a woman he had never even known. And now, in the middle of a heated court case, his grandfather was telling him it was all a lie? Judge Whitmore's expression remained unreadable. These documents confirmed the existence of Sarah Whitman, along with proof of her continued residence in various locations over the past 27 years. Ethan's breath hitched. Where is she now? Margaret, Walter's lawyer, leaned forward. She's in this very courthouse, Ethan. The air seemed to be sucked out of the room. Ethan gripped the edge of the table, his heart racing. What? Margaret turned toward the courtroom doors. Bailiff, please allow Sarah Whitman to enter. A murmur rippled through the court gallery as the doors creaked open. Ethan's chest tightened as a woman walked. In mid-50s, soft brown hair streaked with gray, eyes filled with something between guilt and longing. She was a stranger to him. but deep inside, something felt familiar. Ethan swallowed hard, barely able to form the words. This isn't possible. Sarah Whitman's lips trembled, her eyes locked on him. Ethan, she whispered. His stomach twisted. No, my mother is dead. My mother, Walter interrupted gently. Ethan, listen. Ethan turned toward his grandfather, rage bubbling under his skin. You knew. All these years you knew. Walter nodded solemnly. And I did it to protect you both. Ethan let out a hollow laugh. Protect us? By letting me believe she was dead? Sarah stepped forward cautiously. Ethan, I never wanted to leave you. I had no choice. Ethan's hands curled into fists. No choice? No choice but to abandon your son? Do you have any idea what it was like growing up without you? Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. I know, and I've lived with that pain every single day. Walter cleared his throat. Sarah was in danger, Ethan. Your father, he wasn't the man you thought he was. Ethan frowned. What are you talking about? Sarah hesitated, glancing at Judge Whitmore. Your Honor, may I be allowed to speak freely? The judge nodded. Proceed. Sarah took a shaky breath. Ethan, your father was abusive. He was involved with dangerous people. I tried to leave, but he wouldn't let me. Walter helped me escape before it was too late. If I had stayed, you might have been hurt too. Ethan's world spun. His father? The man he had idolized? He struggled to process the words. Walter sighed. I knew if I just took you away, your father would never stop looking for her. The only way to protect Sarah was to make it look like she was gone forever. So I staged her death and made sure you never questioned it. Ethan's throat tightened. And you never thought to tell me the truth? Sarah wiped her tears. I wanted to, Ethan, but by the time your father was out of the picture, you had already grown up. I was afraid that you would hate me. Ethan looked between his grandfather and his mother, emotions raging inside him. Betrayal, confusion, anger. Judge Whitmore tapped her gavel, pulling the courtroom back to order. Given this new revelation, do you wish to continue this inheritance case, Mr. Sullivan? Ethan swallowed hard. He had come here to fight for a house. But now, he wasn't sure what he was fighting for anymore. The truth had shattered everything. And the court trial was far from over. Ethan felt like the walls of the courtroom were closing in. His breath was uneven, his mind clouded with disbelief. His mother alive, his father an abuser, his grandfather a man who had orchestrated the biggest lie of his life. He had walked into this court case to reclaim a house, but now that house felt insignificant compared to the weight of the truth crushing his chest. Judge Whitmore's voice cut through the silence. Mr. Sullivan, given the revelations presented today, do you wish to proceed with your claim against your grandfather? Ethan clenched his jaw. He had fought so hard to prepare for this battle, believing he was the one being wronged. But now, the foundation of his anger had crumbled beneath him. Richard leaned in. Ethan, listen. You don't have to make a decision now. We can request a recess, give you time to process this. Ethan barely heard him. His gaze remained locked on Sarah, his mother, the woman he had mourned his entire life. Why didn't you try to find me? He asked, his voice raw. Sarah's hands trembled. I did. I followed your life from a distance. I knew when you graduated high school, when you got your first job. I wanted to reach out, but Walter convinced me you were safer believing I was gone. Ethan turned sharply to Walter. You decided that for me? You made that choice without ever considering what I wanted. Walter sighed. If I had told you earlier, you would have gone looking for her, and that could have led you straight to the men your father owed his life to. Ethan shook his head. This isn't just about safety, is it? You didn't tell me because you didn't trust me to handle the truth. Walter remained silent. Margaret cleared her throat. Your Honor, given the emotional nature of today's proceedings, I request we move the discussion back to the case at hand. Judge Whitmore nodded. Agreed. We are here to determine the validity of Mr. Walter Sullivan's will. Now that we know Sarah Whitman's identity, we must establish her rightful claim to the property. Ethan's hands curled into fists. So that's what this is about? Giving her the house. Walter finally spoke. It was never about the house, Ethan. It was about making things right. Ethan scoffed. Right? You think throwing a house at me makes up for 27 years of lies? Sarah's voice broke. It's not about the house. It's about giving us a chance. Ethan let out a bitter laugh. A chance? A chance for what? To pretend like none of this ever happened? Like I didn't just spend my whole life believing I was alone? Walter's expression softened. No, Ethan. It's about giving you the chance to decide for yourself. To know the truth and choose what you want to do with it. Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. And if I walk away from all of this, what happens then? Walter's gaze didn't waver. Then the house goes to Sarah, and you walk away with nothing. But if you stay, you might gain more than just a home. You might gain back the family you lost. The weight of his grandfather's words settled heavily in Ethan's chest. He had spent so long fighting for something he thought belonged to him. But now, standing in this courtroom, he realized he wasn't just fighting for a house. He was fighting against his own pain, his own anger, his own past. Judge Whitmore's voice rang through the room. Mr. Sullivan, do you wish to proceed with the trial? Ethan swallowed hard. He didn't have an answer. Not yet. The court session will adjourn for the day. We will reconvene tomorrow morning. As the gavel struck, the tension in the courtroom lingered. The battle wasn't over. But for the first time, Ethan wasn't sure if he was fighting the right war. Ethan barely noticed the murmurs in the courtroom as people shuffled out. His mind was a storm, swirling with too many emotions, too many revelations. He had come here to fight for a house, but now he wasn't sure what he was fighting for anymore. His mother was alive. His father was a man he never truly knew. And his grandfather had been the architect of a carefully constructed lie, one meant to protect him, but one that had left scars all the same. Richard placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder as they stepped into the courthouse hallway. You need time to think. We can discuss strategy in the morning. Ethan let out a dry laugh. Strategy? Richard, this isn't about legal battles anymore. This is my entire life unraveling in front of me. Richard sighed. Then maybe the best thing to do is step away from it all. You don't have to make any decisions tonight. Ethan wanted to believe that, but how could he? Everything he had built his life around had been a lie. He turned, his eyes locking onto Sarah, who stood near the courtroom doors. Walter was beside her, his expression unreadable. Ethan could see the hesitance in Sarah's posture, the way her fingers twitched as if she wanted to reach for him, but didn't dare. Ethan exhaled sharply. Why now? His voice was quieter than he expected, but the pain behind it was clear. Sarah stepped forward, her voice trembling. Because I couldn't hide anymore. Because you deserve the truth. He let out a bitter chuckle. And what about the past 27 years? Did I not deserve the truth then? Sarah flinched, and Walter spoke up. You weren't ready, Ethan. If we had told you too soon, you would have gone looking for answers in places that could have gotten you killed. Ethan's jaw tightened. So, you decided for me? You played God with my life. Walter's gaze was steady. I made the best choice I could with the information I had. If you had been in my shoes, would you have done any different? Ethan's breath hitched. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to tell Walter that he would have found a better way. But deep down, a tiny part of him wondered if he truly would have. Sarah's voice was softer. I don't expect you to forgive me, Ethan. I don't. Even know if I deserve that. But I do know I can't keep hiding from you. Ethan's throat tightened. You had a lifetime to come back. And you waited until a court case forced the truth out. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, but she didn't look away. I know. And I'll regret that for the rest of my life. The silence between them was heavy. Ethan could feel the weight of the past pressing down on his chest. Walter broke the silence. The house was never about money or inheritance, Ethan. It was a test to see if you cared more about property or about the truth. Ethan scoffed. And if I had just taken the house and moved on? Walter smiled faintly. Then you would have lost something far more important. Ethan swallowed hard. And what if I walk away now? Walter's expression softened. Then, that's your choice. But at least now you know the truth. And the truth, no matter how painful, is always worth knowing. Ethan looked away, staring at the polished marble floor of the courthouse. The truth. It had been handed to him today like a wrecking ball, tearing down everything he thought he knew. Could he really just walk away from it? The answer wasn't clear. And, for the first time in his life, Ethan didn't know what to do. The court battle wasn't over. But now he wasn't sure if he even wanted to fight anymore. Ethan sat in his dimly lit apartment, staring at the ceiling. His mind replayed every word spoken in the courtroom that day, every revelation that had shattered the foundation of his life. He had grown up believing his mother was dead. Now she was alive. He had trusted his grandfather unconditionally. Now he realized Walter had kept a truth from him that changed everything. The house, the thing he had fought for so desperately, was suddenly insignificant compared to what he had lost. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. A message from Richard. Court resumes at 9 a.m. Are we still fighting this? Ethan rubbed his temples. Was there even a case left to fight? Legally, maybe. Emotionally, he wasn't sure. Before he could respond, there was a knock at his door. He hesitated before opening it. Standing there was Sarah. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan stepped aside, not sure what's left to say. Sarah sighed, sitting on the edge of the couch. "I know this is overwhelming." Ethan let out a dry laugh. "That's an understatement." She clasped her hands together. "I never wanted to leave you, Ethan. I need you to believe that." Ethan's jaw clenched. "You had a choice, and you chose to disappear." Tears welled in her eyes. "I was terrified. Your father, he was dangerous. I thought if I left, I could find a way to come back for you. But Walter convinced me that staying away was the only way to keep you safe." Ethan exhaled sharply. "And when my father was gone, when the danger had passed, what stopped you then?" Sarah hesitated. "Fear. Guilt. The thought that you had built a life without me. And maybe I didn't deserve to be part of it anymore." Ethan shook his head. "That wasn't your choice to make. Just like Walter had no right to decide when I was ready for the truth." Sarah wiped at her eyes. "You're right. And I regret it more than you'll ever know." Silence hung between them. Ethan hated how conflicted he felt. A part of him wanted to scream, to demand why she hadn't fought harder to be in his life. But another part of him saw the pain in her eyes, the years of guilt, the weight of her decisions crushing her. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "So what happens now?" Sarah swallowed hard. "I don't know. That's up to you." Ethan leaned back, staring at the ceiling again. "Tomorrow, the court case continues. Do you even want the house?" Sarah sighed. "It was never about the house. Walter wanted to give us a reason to face the truth, to bring everything into the open. He wanted to see if you'd fight for something real." Ethan let out a bitter chuckle. "So all of this, the lawsuit, the will, the inheritance, it was just a test?" Sarah nodded. "A painful one, but yes." Ethan closed his eyes. "And if I walk away from the trial?" Sarah hesitated. "Then the house will belong to me? But I don't care about that. What I care about is whether or not I still have a son." Ethan's chest tightened. He had spent so many years fighting for something. Now he wasn't sure if he was ready to stop fighting, or if he was just afraid of what came next. He didn't have an answer yet. But he knew one thing. Tomorrow, in that courtroom, he had a choice to make. Ethan stood outside the courthouse, staring up at the grand building that had become the center of his turmoil. The morning air was crisp, but his mind was fogged with indecision. Today, the court case would continue, but for the first time, he wasn't sure if he even wanted to fight anymore. Richard arrived, a cup of coffee in hand, You never answered my message, he said, handing it to Ethan. Ethan took the cup, but didn't drink. Because I don't know what to say. Richard exhaled. I've been your lawyer for years, Ethan. I know you. You came here to fight for something that felt rightfully yours. But now you realize it was never about the house, was it? Ethan ran a hand through his hair. It was supposed to be simple. Walter promised me that house when I was a kid. I thought I was fighting for what was mine. But now everything feels different. Richard studied him for a long moment. You're not obligated to continue this. But if you step inside that courtroom, you need to be clear about what you really want. Ethan nodded slowly. I just don't know if I can forgive them. Richard gave him a knowing look. Forgiveness doesn't happen in a court hearing. That's something you'll have to figure out on your own time. With that, Richard stepped inside, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. After a deep breath, Ethan followed. The courtroom was just as tense as the day before. Walter sat calmly, hands folded, while Sarah looked nervous, her gaze flickering between Ethan and the judge's bench. Judge Whitmore entered and called the session to order. Mr. Sullivan, have you decided whether you wish to proceed with your claim? Ethan stood, his heart pounding. Every pair of eyes in the court gallery was on him. He had spent months preparing to fight, to demand what he thought he deserved. But now, standing in front of the judge, his mother, and his grandfather, the truth was clear. The house didn't matter. What mattered was what came next. He exhaled. Your Honor, I wish to withdraw my claim. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Even Richard, who had just advised him to make a decision, looked slightly surprised. Judge Whitmore raised an eyebrow. Are you certain, Mr. Sullivan? Ethan nodded. I came here thinking I was fighting for a home. But I realize now a house doesn't make a family. The truth does. He turned to Walter, his voice steady but laced with pain. You should have told me the truth sooner. You should have given me the choice. Walter met his gaze with quiet understanding. I know. Ethan then turned to Sarah. And you should have come back. Tears welled in her eyes. I know. Ethan inhaled sharply, feeling the weight of years of anger, betrayal, and loss pressing down on him. I don't know how to forgive either of you. I don't even know if I can. But I do know that fighting over a house isn't going to fix anything. Judge Whitmore nodded. Then the case is dismissed. She struck the gavel, and just like that it was over. The legal battle had ended. But the real battle, the one for healing, was just beginning. As the courtroom emptied, Walter approached Ethan. No matter what happens next, I'm proud of you. Ethan swallowed hard. I wish I could say the same. Walter nodded, accepting the pain in Ethan's voice. One day maybe you will. Sarah hesitated before speaking. Ethan, if you ever want to talk, I'm here. Ethan didn't respond right away. Then, after a long pause, he said softly, I don't know what happens next, but I'll let you know when I do. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. And for now that was enough. Ethan stepped outside the courthouse, inhaling deeply. The air was crisp, but it did little to clear the storm in his mind. The court case was over. The house was no longer his concern. But the battle inside him, the anger, the confusion, the aching loss still raged. Sarah and Walter exited behind him, their presence heavy at his back. He knew they were waiting for something, for a sign that the broken pieces of their family could be put back together. But Ethan wasn't sure if that was possible. Richard walked up beside him. Well, that's one way to end a case, he said lightly, attempting humor. Ethan let out a hollow chuckle. Not much of a victory, though. Richard shrugged. Depends on how you define victory. Walking away from a fight takes just as much strength as staying in one. Ethan nodded, but said nothing. He appreciated Richard's support, but this wasn't something legal strategy could fix. Sarah took a tentative step forward. Ethan, would you have dinner with me? Ethan turned to her, his jaw tightening. Dinner? She gave a small, hopeful nod. I know I have no right to ask, but I don't want this to be the last time we speak. Ethan hesitated. A part of him wanted to say no, to walk away and leave the past buried. But another part, the part that had spent years wishing he had his mother, wasn't ready to let go entirely. Walter cleared his throat. It's just dinner, son. You don't have to decide anything today. Ethan shot him a look. You don't get to tell me what I have to do anymore. Walter held up his hands. Fair enough. Ethan exhaled. He glanced at Sarah again, searching her face for deception, for manipulation, for anything that might make this easier. But all he saw was regret. Fine, he said finally. Dinner. But I'm not promising anything beyond that. Sarah nodded, her eyes shining. That's more than I could have hoped for. Walter smiled faintly. I'll leave you two to it then. Ethan frowned. You're not coming? Walter chuckled. I think I've meddled enough, don't you? Ethan didn't argue. Instead, he turned to Sarah. Let's get this over with. She flinched at his tone, but nodded. There's a diner around the corner. Without another word, they started walking. The diner was quiet, only a few. Scattered customers sipping coffee or reading newspapers. They sat in a booth near the window, the silence between them thick. Ethan drummed his fingers against the table. So, where have you been all these years? Sarah sighed. Mostly in different towns, moving every few years. I worked small jobs, nothing permanent. I kept my distance because I thought it was safer that way. Ethan clenched his jaw. Safer for who? Because it sure wasn't safer for me. Sarah flinched. I know, and I will never forgive myself for it. Ethan looked away, staring at the neon sign flickering outside. I spent my whole life wondering what it would have been like to have a mother. Now I don't even know what to say to you. Sarah reached for his hand, then hesitated, pulling back. You don't have to say anything. I'll take whatever you're willing to give, even if it's just this one meal. Ethan exhaled. I don't know if I can forgive you, Sarah. Not yet. She gave him a sad smile. That's okay. I'm not asking you to. I just want to know you, Ethan. Even if it takes time. For the first time, Ethan felt something shift inside. The pain was still there, but maybe, just maybe, there was a path forward. Maybe this wasn't the end after all. Ethan sat across from Sarah in the quiet diner, stirring his coffee without drinking it. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, casting a dull glow over the table between them. It felt strange after a lifetime of believing she was gone. Here she was, sitting within arm's reach. And yet, she still felt so far away. Sarah's hands were wrapped around her own coffee cup, her fingers tapping against the ceramic, as if she were afraid of breaking the silence. I know you don't owe me anything, Ethan, she said softly. But I just need you to know that not a single day passed where I didn't think about you. Ethan let out a slow breath. That doesn't change the fact that you left. I know, Sarah whispered, guilt evident in her voice. And I know that saying I regret it doesn't erase the years I missed. Ethan leaned back, crossing his arms. So why now? Why come back because of a court case? Why not years ago? Sarah hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Because I was scared. I convinced myself that you were better off not knowing the truth. That you had built a life without me, and I had no right to disrupt it. But when Walter told me about the will, I knew it was time to stop running. Ethan frowned. So you would have stayed hidden if he hadn't forced the truth out? She looked away, shame flickering across her face. I don't know. Maybe. But it wasn't just about me, Ethan. It was about you, too. Walter believed you needed to confront the truth. And he was right, wasn't he? Ethan gritted his teeth. I don't know if he was right. I just know that nothing feels real anymore. Sarah swallowed hard. I wish I could undo the pain I caused you. I wish I had been braver. But I can't change the past, Ethan. All I can do is be here now if you'll let me. The weight of her words pressed down on him. He had spent his life imagining what it would be like if his mother had survived. But now that she was sitting in front of him, he didn't feel the relief he had always expected. He just felt lost. A sigh escaped his lips as he stared into his untouched coffee. I don't know what you want from me, Sarah. I don't know what I have left to give. She nodded slowly. I don't want anything, Ethan. I just want a chance to know the man my son has become. Ethan shook his head. I don't even know who that is anymore. The silence stretched between them, thick and unspoken. Outside, the neon diner sign flickered against the window, casting a dull reflection over the tabletop. Sarah gave him a sad smile. Then maybe we can figure it out together. Ethan exhaled sharply. He wasn't ready to forgive her. He wasn't even sure he could. But as much as he hated to admit it, a part of him didn't want to let her disappear again. One dinner doesn't fix everything, he muttered. Sarah nodded. I know. Ethan hesitated, then finally met her gaze. But maybe we can start with this. A tear slipped down Sarah's cheek, but she quickly wiped it away. That's all I could ever ask for. For the first time in days, the tightness in Ethan's chest eased just a little. The court battle had ended. But maybe, just maybe, a different kind of healing was about to begin. Ethan sat in his car outside the diner, staring blankly at the darkened streets. The conversation with Sarah still echoed in his head. He had walked into the courtroom days ago to fight for a house, convinced it was the last connection he had to his family. Now, he realized he had been fighting for something else entirely. He had been fighting to understand why he had been left behind. The answer wasn't simple, and neither was the path forward. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. A message from Richard. Are you okay? Ethan exhaled and typed back. I don't know. A moment later, another message appeared. That's okay. Just don't disappear. Ethan chuckled softly. Richard had a way of keeping things simple. After a long moment, he started the car, but instead of driving home, he found himself heading toward a familiar place. Walter's house. Or rather, Sarah's house now. The front porch light was on, casting a soft glow over the old wooden steps. Ethan hesitated before knocking. A few seconds later, the door creaked open, and Walter stood there, looking both surprised and relieved. Ethan, Walter said, stepping aside. Come in. Ethan walked inside, the scent of old books and coffee filling the air. He had spent his childhood in this house. He had memorized every scratch on the hardwood floors, every creak of the staircase. But tonight it felt different. Sarah was in the living room, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She looked up, eyes widening in surprise. Ethan? Ethan swallowed hard. I don't know why I'm here, he admitted. Walter nodded knowingly. That's okay. Sit. Ethan hesitated before lowering himself onto the couch across from Sarah. She studied him cautiously, as if afraid any wrong move might make him leave. I spent so much time hating you, Ethan finally said. His voice was quiet but firm. Hating you for leaving, for making me believe you were dead. Sarah flinched, but didn't interrupt. Ethan's hands clenched together. And I don't know how to just let that go. I don't know how to undo 27 years of believing something that wasn't true. Walter sighed. You don't have to. Forgiveness isn't about erasing the past, Ethan. It's about deciding if you want to build something beyond it. Ethan let those words settle. He had always thought forgiveness meant forgetting. But maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was just about choosing to move forward. Sarah wiped at her eyes. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I do want to be here, however you let me. Ethan stared at her for a long time before speaking. I don't know how to be a son to someone I don't know. Sarah nodded, a small, hopeful smile forming. Then let's start by just being people who are trying. Ethan exhaled slowly. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if the wounds between them could ever fully heal. But for the first time, he was willing to try. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Months later, Ethan stood outside the courthouse, watching as another family walked inside, probably caught in their own battle over money, inheritance, or something else that felt important in the moment. He understood now that courtrooms weren't just places where disputes were settled. They were places where truths came out, where families broke apart or found a way back together. His battle had ended, not with a legal victory, but with something more meaningful, a chance to rebuild. And as he stepped away from the courthouse, Ethan realized some battles weren't about winning. Some battles were about choosing what mattered most. Life is full of unexpected twists, just like this story. Sometimes, the battles we fight aren't about what we think we're fighting for, but about discovering the truth, facing the past, and choosing what matters most. What would you have done in Ethan's place? Could you forgive? Or would the past be too much to let go of? Let us know in the comments and tell us where in the world you're watching from. We love hearing from viewers all around the globe. If you enjoyed the story and want more gripping emotional narratives, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.